Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is November the 30th of 2015. We're going to be talking about a lot of issues tonight, most notably the Russian jet being downed over Syria by Turkey. Going to be getting into that discussion as well. A lot of developments in that area. The world is edging closer to World War III. This is a real danger now. Some of the warnings that we issued in the past some time ago have now come to fruition. The direct military conflict between Russia, or the Russian bloc, and NATO have actually taken place. Now, the question is, will it escalate? Will it de-escalate? Is this a one-off incident? Or are we going to see the increase in these types of incidents? If we certainly hope that we don't, but what are the options here? We're going to take a look at that. The world is indeed edging closer to a very, very destructive situation. Add to this the potential for economic collapse, which we've been hearing about, the rumblings about this for quite some time. There have been warnings about an economic crisis coming in the middle of December, right around the time of Christmas. This involves some of the markets, the derivatives markets, some of the commodities markets. It also involves the government shutdown potential over versus the Republicans versus the Democrats, kind of jockeying for political viability there in Washington, D.C. The potential for a government shutdown is looming as well. We have this perfect storm that is gathering in terms of the economic crisis for sometime in December. Now, we are not predicting a crash in December. Let's be clear with that. I want to be very clear in that I am not saying that we're going to have a collapse in December. Some outlets will claim that there's a collapse every October, every November, every December, and scare you to death, and you end up doing nothing but laying around in the fetal position in a panic. But this is something that we should nevertheless pay attention to in that regard. Of course, we have a number of other issues that we need to look at as well. Potential for solar flares, solar storms in the near future. Those types of things are looming in the distance as well. But before we go into anything tonight, I want to remind the listeners, if you're listening to us for the first time tonight, you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. And you can go to the show's webpage, ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks, and see the archives, see the YouTube videos, see the links to my most recent articles as posted on BrandonTurbeville.com. All that's there at the webpage. If you want to keep track of my work, I write regularly for ActivistPost.com, NaturalBlaze.com, and occasionally for the Antimedia.org. But if you're interested in my work specifically, then I strongly encourage you to go to BrandonTurbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of the articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archives of this show, all of the relevant information. Anything that has to do with me or my work will be located at BrandonTurbeville.com. There's also a books tab where you can click on that and find the books. The most recent book, The Difference It Makes, 36 Reasons Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President, is now available in Kindle, hard copy, and free PDF. We've also got Codex Alimentarius, End of Health Freedom, my first book, which is now available in hard copy on Amazon as well. And we're going to be expanding the books out there as they become more and more available on Amazon, on Kindle, and that sort of thing. You'll be able to get these books more easily, hopefully for the holidays. So we hope to do that as soon as possible. So keep checking back with us on that. Also, go to BrandonTurbeville.com. The site is updated virtually every day with new articles, interviews, and that sort of thing. You can just go by there and check it. You should be going there in any event, because that should be your hub for a lot of the the information that's coming out regarding current events. So, with that, we need to take a look at what has happened here. The downing of the Russian jet. So let's take a look at what has happened. Right, we had a drastic escalation in the potential for what could essentially turn into World War III, with the NATO bloc engaging in direct military confrontation with the Russian alliance. This took place on November 24th, I believe. Turkey announced that it had shot down a Russian jet. The Russian government confirmed that claim shortly thereafter. The Turks argued that the Russian jet violated Turkish airspace. The Russians deny this claim. There is some evidence that exists that suggested that the plane was within Turkish airspace. Not really sure how credible that information is. Regardless, if it was credible, the plane had only been going for 9 seconds worth of traveling time, if the coordinates are accurate that we're talking about, that shows it was in Turkish airspace. The Russian Defense Ministry stated right after, quote, "We are looking into the circumstances of the crash of the Russian jet. The Ministry of Defense would like to stress that the plane was over the Syrian territory throughout the flight," end quote. Now, the information that we have, when I say there was some evidence that the plane was over Turkish airspace, that should be taken to mean what I just said, right? There is some evidence, but most evidence suggests that the plane was indeed in Syrian airspace. Syrian airspace. Now, let me bring a question here to all the listeners and to Turkey. The idea is that Russian jets, according to Turkey, had violated Turkish airspace, and to protect their national sovereignty and to protect their safety, Turkey brought down the Russian jet. Well, is there any reason to believe that the Russians were going to bomb Turkey? Is there any legitimate reason to believe that the Russians were going to bomb Turkey? No, there is not. Russia and Turkey are considered allies, at least on friendly terms. So why would a Russian jet who's been bombing ISIS, purportedly the same enemy that Turkey has, at least publicly, why would Turkey knock down a Russian jet? Why would they do that? Well, we'll get into that shortly. Now, the Russians claim that the plane was brought down by artillery fire. This was early on. Turkish military said it was shot down by a Turkish F-16 after it had ignored numerous warnings. Now, the Russians have released information from this pilot. There were 2 pilots that crashed. And you could see the pilots floating downwards after the crash, after they had ejected, and they were fired upon by Obama's moderate rebels, the relatively moderate rebels who took pot shots at these guys as they were floating down helplessly off of parachutes. Killed one of them. It's not clear whether or not he was killed before he hit the ground, or if he was, tortured and murdered by the relatively moderate cannibals of the United States. But one pilot got away, and it was with help from the Russian crews searching for the pilot, which they lost a Russian soldier who was fired on, who was in a helicopter. And it was also in concert with the Syrian military forces, who banded together and fought hard to get this guy back, and they did. And what he says is, now he's been debriefed, and he says, no, we were never given any warnings about where we were at, or how, that we were in Turkish airspace. He doesn't say he was in Turkish airspace at all, but he says there were no warnings. Turkey says there were 17. The pilot says there were 0. So we've got that. Now, the plane actually crashed on Syrian territory. Again, most evidence suggests that this plane was over Syrian territory the whole time. It was about 19,685 feet up in the air when it was shot down. Again, Turkey has long claimed special privileges over northern Syria. Right? They've created a de facto no-fly zone over Syrian territory, approximately 10 miles into Syria, 6 to 10 miles. So they say, we want to protect Turkish airspace, so we're going to say with 10 miles into Syria now as a no-fly zone, we'll consider that our own territory if anybody flies over it. So we got to wonder, is this where, of course that's illegitimate, you can't do that, but we got to wonder, is this where the Russian jet was brought down, over this 10-mile area over Syria? If that's the case, again, clear evidence that the plane was in Syria. Vladimir Putin labeled the downing of the jet as a stab in the back by accomplices of terrorism. That's true. An emergency meeting of NATO was called then by Turkey. The idea of this emergency meeting was to inform the allies, the NATO allies, about the downing of the Russian plane. According to Carmen Romero, the NATO deputy spokesperson, Turkey's shooting down of the Russian jet, of course, continues, comes as the Russian and Syrian forces continue their march across northern Syria and Aleppo, and as terrorist targets in places like Raqqa are finally being destroyed from the air, thanks to the Russians. If NATO doesn't respond soon, it's going to be the end of the geopolitical plans of the Anglo-Americans in Syria, and of course it would be the end for the trained terrorist monkeys who've raped and beheaded their way across the Middle East for the last 4 to 5 years. This shows us to some extent the lengths to which NATO and particularly Turkey's Erdogan are going to go to defend and support ISIS. We've entered frightening new territory in that regard, but let's need to continue this discussion because I want to point out something about Turkey. A lot of people may not know the extent to which Turkey is involved in supporting these death squad terrorists. Certainly the listeners to this show are going to be familiar with the fact that Turkey is virtually well known, even in much of the mainstream media, that ISIS terrorists and moderate cannibals are coming through Turkish territory. There are sort of the rat lines, I guess you would say. These terrorists come through Turkey down to this Jarablus corridor, which is the only area in which they're really able to get through now, because the Kurds have seized much of that northern Syria border with Turkey. This one area that hasn't been seized, we call that the Jarablus corridor. It's about 60 miles wide from Jarablus in the east to Efrin or Azaz in the west, and this is the bottleneck of death squads coming through via Turkey with Turkish support. So most of my listeners are going to be familiar with that. We've pretty much talked about the role of Turkey in funding and supporting ISIS for the last few years here, bits and pieces, but I want to really drive this point home because this is important. What we have here, the Turkish support for terror, Turkey has really had an undying level of support for ISIS and other terrorist organizations. We should give honorable mention here to Turkey and the possibility of war between the Russian and NATO alliance, because it was Turkey who really fired the first shot of World War III if this happens. We can look back to this moment and say this was the first shot if this escalates. Turkey has been known as one of the most fervent supporters of terror in Syria since the beginning of the crisis. It's consistently allowed its territory to be used as a staging ground for ISIS, for Nusra, for a number of other terrorist organizations to enter Syria for the purpose of destroying the secular government of Bashar al-Assad. We had a good article, a very good article by Dr. Nafiz Ahmed entitled "NATO is Harboring the Islamic State," and he wrote this for Insurge Intelligence, but it was reposted many other places. So I would recommend pulling up that article. It's a very good article. He documents a lot of this Turkish involvement here. We've got Holland now wanting European leaders to suspend the Schengen Agreement on open borders to allow more restrictions on the freedom of movement across Europe in terms of the borders because of the migrant crisis. And by the way, the open borders in Europe have to be stopped. We're a fan of this of the closure of borders to prevent this massive immigration. Hollande has demanded the EU-wide adoption of the passenger name record system, allowing intelligence services to meticulously track the travel patterns of Europeans, along with an extension of the state of emergency to at least 3 months. Now, he's essentially demanding a police state, a bigger police state than France already is. So under the extension, what France is doing, they can block any website, put people under house arrest without trial, they can search homes without a warrant, they can prevent suspects from meeting others deemed a threat. This is police state, right? Mass surveillance at home, endless military projection abroad. These are the national security state, the perpetual war state. But we don't see any mention from Hollande or any other national leader about state sponsorship, right? Why has there been no discussion of state sponsorship? Well, we know why there hasn't been any discussion of state sponsorship, because why would the governments talk about state sponsorship when their states are sponsoring ISIS? But we have these indestructible Syrian passports. We got to mention those, discovered near the bodies of two of these Paris suicide bombers that just can't be destroyed by normal means. They were obviously forged, but they were apparently traced to Turkey. But I think in that instance we can look more toward the DGSE than even Turkey, simply because the DGSE obviously had involvement in these Paris attacks. Now, we had earlier this year the Turkish daily Today's Zaman report that, quote, more than 100,000 fake Turkish passports had been given to ISIS. Now, this is not connected to the Paris attacks, right? Because the passport that was found at the Paris attacks, this is beyond belief, right? This is fantasy land. This is 9/11 passports are in a fire that can melt steel beams, but not paper passports kind of situation. But Turkey has indeed manufactured 100,000 fake Turkish passports to be given to ISIS fighters. Erdogan's government has been accused, and this is according to the Turkish newspaper, has been accused of supporting the terrorist organization by turning a blind eye to its militants crossing the border and even buying its oil. Based on a 2014 report, Sezgin Tankulo, the deputy chairman of the main opposition Republican People's Party, the CHP, said that ISIL terrorists fighting in Syria have also been claimed to have been treated in hospitals in Turkey, end quote. So all of that, of course, just barely scratches the surface. We have with a senior Western official who's unnamed, but he is allegedly familiar with a large cache of intelligence obtained over this past summer. He told The Guardian that, quote, direct dealings between Turkish officials and ranking ISIS members was now undeniable. That is his direct quote. The same person told The Guardian that Turkey is not just supporting ISIS, but it's also supporting other jihadist groups, the Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, all those groups. He says the distinctions they draw with other opposition groups are thin indeed. There is no doubt at all that they militarily cooperate with both. Yeah, well, of course they do, because there is no difference between Ahrar al-Sham, ISIS, and Nusra. It's the same group. It's essentially the same group. So, of course, they wouldn't make any distinction. Now, I just want to point out, for people who say, yeah, Turkey and NATO, no, it's not Turkey and NATO. Turkey is NATO. Turkey is a NATO country. So whenever you see that Turkey is harboring terrorists, Turkey is funding terrorists, Turkey is supporting terrorists, that could be translated. That could be translated to mean NATO is harboring terrorists. NATO is supporting terrorists. NATO is funding terrorists. Turkey is NATO. They are a NATO member. Now, We've got even Newsweek is reporting the testimony of a former ISIS communications technician who had went to Syria to fight against Assad. This guy told Newsweek that Turkey was allowing ISIS trucks from Raqqa to cross the border through Turkey and then back across the border to attack Syrian Kurds in the city of Sarakania in northern Syria in February. So he says the ISIS fighters would freely travel through Turkey in a convoy of trucks and stop at safe houses along the way. This guy also said that he would routinely, quote, connect ISIS field captains and commanders from Syria with people in Turkey on innumerable occasions. Also said that people they talked to were Turkish officials. ISIS commanders told us to fear nothing at all because there was full cooperation with the Turks. That's the direct quote from him. We've also got January. We had the official documents of the Turkish military were leaked online. They were authenticated, so we know that they're real. They showed that Turkey's intelligence services had been caught in Adana by military officials. These intelligence services were transporting missiles, mortars, anti-aircraft ammunition by truck to Al-Qaeda in Syria. So the military caught them and were told to release them because they were intelligence services working in the service of the higher power there in Turkey. There is this idea that ISIS is self-supporting itself through Twitter donations, wealthy Islamists, and extracting oil and processing it and sending it abroad. This is a fairy tale, right? There is no self-sustaining economy for ISIS. We've had reports coming from the mainstream media saying that there is, but I'm sorry, this is a fantasy. We also have an article by Martin Chulov of The Guardian where he interviewed a so-called senior ISIS member, and he says, quote, "They need the Turks. I know a lot of cooperation, and it scares me. I don't see how Turkey can attack the organization too hard. There are shared interests," end quote. So, of course, there's shared interests. Now, NATO leaders are, of course, feigning outrage, and they say, we just don't know how ISIS can continue to fund itself and how it can continue to expand and support itself. Well, we just went through it, right? They are receiving donations from wealthy Islamists. Of course, in Saudi Arabia, there's plenty of wealthy Islamists. They are receiving donations from people outside of Syria and Iraq. Clearly, they are. But it's called NATO, and it's called Israel, and it's called the GCC. And yes, they are supporting themselves partially through extracting oil and selling it to Turkey, to NATO, right? This is how it happens. And we had also, let's continue moving on here. We had Claudia Roth, who is the deputy speaker of the German Parliament. She actually expressed some shock that NATO is allowing Turkey to harbor an ISIS camp in Istanbul. Right? So there's an ISIS camp, a training camp, in Istanbul. She was shocked that NATO was allowing Turkey to facilitate weapons transfers to the Islamist militants through its borders and tacitly support the Islamic State through its oil sales. But of course, nothing happened. We've seen Turkey being rewarded for its alliance with ISIS. German Chancellor Angela Merkel offered to fast-track Turkey's bid to join the EU, another mistake for everybody involved. She's now permitting visa-free travel to Europe for Turks. We've also, remember this testimony that we had from General Martin Dempsey. Not a fan of General Martin Dempsey. He was then the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was being questioned by Senator Lindsey Graham, for which we in South Carolina apologize to the world. We don't vote for this guy, but he just keeps winning. Graham asked Dempsey whether or not he knew of any major Arab ally that embraces ISIL. And Dempsey replied, "I know major Arab allies who fund them." We didn't go any further than that. in that questioning, of course, but it's nevertheless a good idea to have that on the record. So basically, the most senior U.S. military official at the time confirmed that ISIS was being funded by major Arab allies, but we didn't go any further to find out who these people were. Well, we know. All right, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman even, basically the entire Gulf Cooperation Council. These people, these countries have funded and funneled billions of dollars to ISIS fighters and terrorists in Syria for at least the last 4 years, at least. But I think we've documented here on this show and in the articles a lot further back than that. So it's no wonder that these supposedly anti-ISIS airstrikes are already minuscule, have now been reduced to almost zero. They focus instead on bombing Shia Houthis in Yemen, which is paving the way for ISIS to expand there. So remember, the bombing of Yemen is not only killing civilians left and right, it's designed to protect Saudi Arabia. They don't want a Shia Yemen. They don't want that on their borders. They don't want Iranian influence on their borders. So they are bombing Yemen to stop that and killing civilians all the way. Al-Qaeda, of course, now rising to prominence in Yemen, which is fine with Saudi Arabia. But it's clear, ISIS is state-sponsored terrorism. It's clear. There is no doubt about this. It's sponsored by Western-friendly regimes in the Muslim world, and it's funded by Western regimes in the Western world. So we know what this is. So, again, Hollande, he should be asked why they're expressing their determination, the French here, are to destroy ISIS using all the means necessary, but they have yet to question Turkey and its support for ISIS. They've yet to question the United States and its support for ISIS. They've yet to question their own government and its support for ISIS. They have repeatedly stuck to the ridiculous and stupid line that Assad must go. Well, Assad must not go. Assad must stay. He must stay in power. We must work with existing governments. This is not the choice of Hollande, whether or not Assad goes or stays. So, given his approval rating compared to Assad's, I would say it's time for Hollande to go. I think it's time for him to go into exile and leave France. Perhaps Putin and Assad and Rouhani should get together and liberate France from the brutal dictator that is Hollande, right? Or the French oligarchy that keeps its people in a state of absolute oppression, because there's no freedom of thought in France. There's no economic freedom in France. There's no personal liberties in France. There's no right to defend yourself in France. We could go on and on. All right, the place is not a free country. So why don't we get some countries that have nothing to do with France? Why don't we get Russia and Iran and Syria together, and then demand that Hollande step down? And if he doesn't, let's have them invade. Right? How does that sound? That's what it worked for Syria. Why not for countries in Western Europe? Now, Tony Cartolucci also has done a number of articles about the Turkish funding of terrorism and support for terrorism. He's got a great article entitled "Implausible Deniability: West's ISIS Terror Hordes in Iraq" that I would suggest that you go take a look at. He's also got a few more. Perhaps we'll mention them as we move on. But we got to mention a few more things because I don't want to spend the entire show on this. Back in 2011, actually even as early as 2007, I think we can go to 2006, 2005 as well, the United States has been arming, funding, and supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and a number of armed terrorist organizations to overthrow Assad in Syria and to fight Hezbollah in Lebanon and to undermine the power and influence of Iran. That really includes any government or group in the Middle Eastern region or North African region that's friendly toward Iran. Billions in cash had been funded into the hands of different groups, including al-Nusra, al-Qaeda in Iraq, what's now being called ISIS. You can see by any map of ISIS territory, that it butts up directly against Turkey's borders. And this was maybe not so much now because all we have is that Jarablus corridor, but prior to the Kurds seizing of the borders, it butts up directly toward the Turkish borders, and they have these defined corridors that ISIS used to invade southward. This is because it was coming from NATO territory, right? ISIS was harbored on NATO territory. It was armed and funded by U.S. CIA agents with cash and weapons brought in from the Saudis and the Qataris and NATO members themselves. And of course, we can't. We have to give honorable mention to the Israelis here, who provide them with medical treatment and passageways into Syria as well. So this so-called non-lethal aid the U.S. and the British were sending included the vehicles that you see ISIS driving around in. So you just got to remember, ISIS is the product of a joint NATO, GCC, Israeli conspiracy that goes back as far as, I would argue, 2005, when, and potentially much earlier than that, but where these U.S. and Saudi policymakers really wanted to ignite a region-wide sectarian war to purge the Middle East of Iran's arc of influence that goes from its borders across Syria and Iraq and as far west as Lebanon to the coast of the Mediterranean. ISIS has been harbored, it has been trained, it has been armed, it has been funded by a coalition of NATO and the GCC with the Israelis. And Turkey's borders have launched invasions into northern Syria at times with Turkish artillery and air cover. We had that situation where there was a cross-border invasion by Al-Qaeda into Qasab village in Latakia province in northwestern Syria. This was an invasion that was coordinated with NATO, with Turkey, with Israel, and with the death squads, where Israel acted as air force cover while Turkey facilitated the death squads from their own borders into Syria. Remember also, prior to the rapid appearance and seizure of territory by ISIS in Syria and Iraq, when the United States mainstream media could tell you nothing about it, European media, we had Der Spiegel, the German magazine, reporting that hundreds of fighters were being trained in Jordan by Western intelligence and military personnel for the purpose of deployment in Syria to fight against Assad. The numbers were expected to reach about 10,000 fighters when the reports were issued back in March 2013. Now, the Western and European media outlets later tried to spin that operation as the training of moderate rebels, but subsequent reports came out and revealed that these fighters were actually ISIS fighters. So those fighters were ultimately funneled into Syria via Turkey. October 2nd, 2014, Turkey's parliament passed a resolution to allow the Turkish military to enter the sovereign territory of Iraq and Syria under the pretext of battling the Islamic State militants that it supports. So there's that as well. That resolution also allowed foreign troops to use Turkish territory for the same purpose, which gave us a clue early on that the Incirlik air base was going to be used by the United States for airstrikes against Syria. There was a formal agreement that was reached between the United States and Turkey for the use of Incirlik in the fake American campaign against ISIS. So the vote on that resolution regarding the foreign troops on Turkish soil to be used in Syria was 298 in favor and 98 opposed, so it passed. Now, who is Turkey's real enemy? Well, it's the Assad government, because despite its claim that the vote was centered around defeating ISIS on its borders, Recep Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, probably inadvertently admitted that the real target of NATO aggression is actually the Syrian government. This is a BBC report. Listen. Speaking in Parliament earlier on Wednesday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan urged the West to find a long-term solution to the crises in Syria and Iraq, pointing out that dropping tons of bombs on ISIS militants would only provide a temporary respite. While he said an effective struggle against ISIS would be a priority for Turkey, the immediate removal of the administration in Damascus would also continue to be its priority. Erdogan also called for a buffer zone on the Turkey-Syria border, which would be enforced by a no-fly zone to ensure security. End quote. So that's the enemy, right? It's not so much ISIS, it's Assad. That's what he's saying. So Turkey has been at the front and center of the promotion of Uyghur terrorism in Syria and Asia. I should mention that. We went through that whole thing here on this show. But Turkey's been involved with the promotion of Uyghur terrorism in Syria and other locations, but all over Asia. Turkey's repeatedly violated Syrian territory and engaged in limited military action against the Syrian military in support of ISIS and other jihadists connected to some of the hundreds of smaller groups and factions. I think now we've got 300 groups in Syria. Turkey has long advocated for a no-fly zone over Syria, a buffer zone, if you will. That's long been part of the Nato agenda against Syria since the beginning of this whole controlled crisis in the country. It was under the guise of a humanitarian corridor, a buffer zone in Libya, that NATO bombing took place in Libya, which ultimately led to the destruction of the Libyan government and the murder of Gaddafi and the expansion of chaos that ensued. And it is total anarchy and chaos and genocide across the entire North African country. Now, let's talk for a second about the safe zone. Okay, the safe zone. We had the discussion about the implementation of what they called at the time a buffer zone, going back as far as 2012, by the Brookings Institution. They had a memo entitled Assessing Options for Regime Change. And this is what they said, quote, "An alternative is for diplomatic efforts to focus first on how to end the violence and how to gain humanitarian access, as is being done under Annan's leadership. This may lead to the creation of safe havens and humanitarian corridors, which would have to be backed by limited military power. This would, of course, fall short of U.S. goals for Syria and could preserve Assad in power. From that starting point, however, it is possible that a broad coalition with the appropriate international mandate could add further coercive action to its efforts." End quote. Now, the Brookings Institution went a little bit further in that document, and they described a possible scenario that mirrors the one that we now see in Syria, where Turkey, in coordination with Israel, could help overthrow Assad by creating what they define as a multi-front war on Syria's borders. So let me read this, get this out. In addition, Israel's intelligence services have a strong knowledge of Syria as well as assets within the Syrian regime that could be used to subvert the regime's power base and press for Assad's removal. Israel could posture forces on or near the Golan Heights and in so doing might divert regime forces from suppressing the opposition. This posture may conjure fears in the Assad regime of a multi-front war, particularly if Turkey is willing to do the same on its border and if the Syrian opposition is being fed a steady diet of arms and training. Such a mobilization could perhaps persuade Syria's military leadership to oust Assad in order to preserve itself. Advocates argue that this additional pressure could tip the balance against Assad inside Syria if other forces were aligned properly. Okay, end quote. So we have these U.S. airstrikes basically carving out a vacuum that's going to be filled with extremists uncontested by the Syrian army, who would have to force to be to back off in fear of provoking further Western aggression. That situation would undoubtedly deteriorate. Thankfully, the Russians have been involved and have pushed that idea back a little bit. But we also see where we have Turkey staging false flag operations along its border a few years ago in an attempt to trigger a war with Syria directly, in addition to supporting terrorists that caused this humanitarian catastrophe that's somewhat spilling over into Turkey's territory. Not as much as you'd think, but somewhat. The vacuum that the U.S. and NATO have intentionally created is meant to be filled with terrorist mercenaries, the safe zone that would be filled with terrorists and, of course, civilians and American soldiers to be used as human shields, essentially targets, decoys. The Turkish agenda is not focused on combating ISIS. If it was focused on combating ISIS, it would have long ago sealed their border with Syria, as well as stopped training and facilitating the terrorist groups to begin with. The Turks don't need a NATO buffer zone to end terrorism with their own country. They need to seal the borders with Syria immediately, They need to cease funding immediately and training and facilitation of these terrorists immediately that are operating inside Turkey's borders alongside this massive terrorist facilitation tunnel. So they need to shut these things down. They need a massive sting operation, a netting operation that eliminates these organizations once and for all. They would also greatly benefit by backing away from Erdogan and this idiot and his likewise idiotic policies and his idiotic Islamist government. You've got to put this political Islam aside, right? You got to get to a culture of secular governments. You got to drop this political religion. We don't support political Islam, political Judaism, or political Christianity. This is the world has experimented with theocracy before, and I think we can say that we've had enough of that. Turkey needs to pursue a reasonable and fair policy toward the Kurds in its southeast. Enough with restricting the rights of these people. Enough of that. There's no point. There's no point in it. Basically, Turkey has sent every signal possible that they intend to stick with the NATO line of destroying Assad and replacing Assad with some government beholden to Washington and the Anglo-American oligarchy. They're going to try for this buffer zone and no-fly zone, but that's tantamount to war. That's an open military assault against the government of Assad, because the implementation of that type of zone would require airstrikes against Assad's air defense systems. That's an air war. And with the establishment of this buffer zone, you would also have a new staging ground that would be open and allow terrorists like ISIS and others to gain the ability to conduct attacks even deeper inside Syria. So let's just close with this in terms of about the Russian jet incident and put this in context. The most recent actions of Turkey are coming now as the Russians and the Syrian forces are stepping up their assaults against ISIS terrorists, particularly in northern Syria and Aleppo, and as the Russians decimate targets in Raqqa, these places that are finally being bombed from the air. The SAA, the Syrian military, is poised to cut off a major supply route of ISIS near Qassab in the form of the M4 highway. In other words, the M4 highway is one of those areas that still has a transportation route for ISIS terrorists, and the Syrian military is closing in on that. Once they shut down that M4 highway, that transportation route from north to south, I believe that's north to south, although it winds in some places, will be shut down for the ISIS terrorists in that general area, right? Basically, the access of the Turkish military and terrorists to Latakia province is 100% dependent on that M4 highway. So if they want to get there, they have to take the M4 and then they can get to minor roads. But if they collapse on the M4 highway, particularly on the positions north of the M4, which is not very far from happening, by the way, then the Syrian army is going to have artillery control over the M4, and the terrorists inside Latakia province are going to be cut off. They're going to be surrounded. They're going to be by themselves. They're going to be alone. They can surrender or die. We also see in Iraq, we saw a situation where another highway was cut there, now cutting the Islamic State in half. Good for the Iraqi army for doing that. So we see that NATO is losing and ISIS is losing. And if they don't do something soon, it's going to be the end for their plans in Syria. So it's without a doubt that NATO is responding by trying to call Russia's bluff, which is an incredibly dangerous and stupid move. They're either trying to bully the Russians out of Syria or risk a direct confrontation with them in the process. Now, here's the question that I'll leave you with in regards to this issue, and then I want to pick on Turkey about something else. The question that I want to leave you with this specific incident is as idiotic as Erdogan might be. Erdogan is well aware of the fact that Turkey versus Russia will always end, at least in the context that we are in now in 2015, with a Russian victory. If there was a direct war between Russia and Turkey, Russia would win. That's fairly fairly clear. Erdogan knows this. Everybody knows this. Downing the Russian jet is pushing it. That is pushing direct military conflict. Do you think for 1 second that Erdogan would have provoked Russia without the backing and the reassurance of the rest of NATO? We can't lay all the blame on Turkey. As again, this is an Anglo-American NATO conspiracy here, along with the GCC and Israel. So this spans many continents, many countries, many cultures. It is a worldwide oligarchy, but can't lay this on the feet of Turkey alone, because you can't tell me that Turkey would provoke the Russians without the reassurance of other NATO powers, particularly the United States, that it would have NATO backing if things went wrong. And that makes the situation even more dangerous if Russia does launch an airstrike into Turkey as a response, by the way. And it doesn't appear that that's going to happen. Russia is showing all signs of it, that it's trying to avoid World War III, and it's reacting with a cool head. But let's say, hypothetically, Russia reacted as the United States would and started bombing, launching missiles into Turkish territory. That's not an attack on Turkey. That's an attack on NATO, which means that's an attack on the United States. That's an attack on France, on Britain. So essentially, that would be World War III. Now, enough with the hypotheticals. I want to. While we're on Turkey, I want to bring some other things up. We've got the situation in Syria, which we've just covered, but we haven't talked as much lately about the situation in Crimea, in Ukraine. So while we got the situation in Syria heating up on the heels of this military jet shoot down, the situation in Ukraine is starting to heat up a little bit as well, because we've got the Western-backed fascist Kiev regime poking Russia on that end of the spectrum. We've had these mysterious blasts that took place in the Kherson region of Ukraine over the past weekend. So not this weekend, not Saturday and Sunday prior, but the one prior to that. So basically, not this weekend, but the one prior. These blasts took out a number of power lines, and it's left about 2 million people without power in Crimea. The Ukrainian government is now officially halting aid shipments to Crimea. They've got activists, and I put activists in scare quotes, because they're out there inside Crimea blocking the repair of the power lines. The Kherson region, of course, is in the southeastern Ukraine area. It's on the border with Crimea. These blasts brought down electricity pylons that served Crimea, although the intended target was apparently a currency exchange located in Kherson. The man supposedly demanded cash before detonating the bomb in the building. Another bomb was found shortly after the incident outside. There was a separate explosion that took place in Odessa. There's another city in the southeastern region of Ukraine where we had the Odessa massacre, where they brought all these pro-Russian protesters in, locked them in the trade union hall, and burned them to death. There were explosives found later near the power lines, according to officials, and that prevented crews from being able to repair them. And shortly after all this, we had a group of activists, again, activists in scare quotes. These were Crimean Tatars. They've been out protesting. They blocked the repair crews from restoring power to the areas that are suffering from the outage. The demands of these activists are that a tougher line be taken against Moscow. And of course, this tougher line essentially means doing more to restore Crimea to Ukraine and basically take it back from Russia. Back in September, we had these same activists, these Tatars, stalking the border between Crimea and mainland Ukraine and basically attempting to block any commercial trucks from entering the peninsula. But now the Ukrainian fascists have responded by decreeing that all vehicles hauling goods to and from Crimea be temporarily halted. So we've got an article from Laura Mills for the Wall Street Journal. Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk asked his cabinet to formalize the decree by drafting a law that would take into account the interests of our brotherly Crimean Tatar people. We aren't satisfied with today's status quo when an occupying power neglects the basic rights of the Crimean Tatar people, said President Petro Poroshenko after a meeting with the 3 European foreign ministers. Crimea is Ukrainian territory. We will defend the rights of the Crimean Tatar people and all Ukrainians who are living on occupied territory. End quote. So it's unclear whether or not the bombing itself was engineered by Ukrainian or Western or NATO forces, or if it was some type of coordinated attack, or whether it was just some bizarre robbery plan that went wrong. But given the history and methodology of NATO and Ukraine and the West in general, the circumstances around these bombings are highly suspect. Remember, the bombings came so close together, suggesting the possibility of coordination. It succeeded in knocking out civilian power in a highly convenient manner at a highly convenient time, and the resulting measures coming from these activist Tatars and the Ukrainian government, it'd be reasonable to suggest that a country that would allow, the pro-Russian activists to be burned to death at a train union hall would carry out bombings to achieve a greater political goal, geopolitical goal. So remember, Turkey and Ukraine, back to Turkey again, have already conferred in order to establish Muslim brigades to be used against Russia in Crimea. Back in August, on August the 1st, August the 2nd, we had a meeting at the Hotel Bilkent in Ankara, Turkey, that was called the Second World Congress of the Tatars. This meeting had about 200 Tatar NGOs and associations from all over the world. The event was attended by Pavlo Klimkin, was the Ukrainian foreign minister, also the Turkish deputy prime minister Numan Kurtulmus. Both of those guys participated. Zaman, the Turkish website, reports that there were, again, 200 Crimean Tatar non-governmental organizations, and that they were discussing the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and the situation of the Tatars in Crimea. It focused on these supposedly dire conditions under which Crimean Tatars have had to live, and the pressure on their cultural life. Well, we don't know how that is necessarily legitimate. Remember, these NGOs tend to mean that if you can't have your own religious dictatorship in your own territory, in your own micro-state or mini-state, then you're being oppressed. This is the Brzezinski version of dignity, right? So there was a decision made at this meeting, and it was announced by Mustafa Abdul Samil Similoglu, who is the leader of the Crimean Tatars, as decreed by Poroshenko. They agreed to create a Muslim brigade to oppose Crimean separatism, which means pro-Russian Crimeans, and as well as human trafficking and the transportation of goods near conflict zones. Well, the first one and the last one have been accomplished, right? In other words, the creation of a terrorist brigade, this is what they're looking at, to combat Russian involvement in Crimea and pro-Russian sentiment and activism in the area. Now, this Similoglu guy is a notorious CIA asset, and he's been a collaborator throughout the years of the Reagan administration. He was the former leader of the Crimean Tatar Majlis. The announcement, again, was made by Similoglu. He was received by Erdogan, who assured him that Turkey was supporting the Tatars against Russia. Turkey's been pretty vocal about the so-called territorial integrity of Ukraine, not so much Syria, but Ukraine, and has taken a strong anti-Russian stance on the issue there. But this Muslim brigade was indeed supposed to be based at Kherson, the same place these bombs went off, and that, which is, again, near the Crimean border. It includes volunteers and jihadists from a number of other locations in the region: Tatarstan, what they're calling it, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Chechnya, Georgia. Of course, Turkey wasn't going to be left out of the mix, because it agreed to commit a number of the jihadists that are currently operating within its own borders, to go into Syria. They've agreed to take some of these terrorists out of Syria and send them to Ukraine. They even did that as far back as 2013, before some of these decisions were officially made, where Turkish intelligence sent a number of Tatar jihadists to Ukraine so they could be able to assist in the Western Color Revolution in Kiev, where the terrorists actually acted as security for pro-European and anti-Russian protests in the Maidan. And these guys were largely suspected of being the culprits behind a number of violent acts that resulted in the crackdown by police. We've got reports coming from Voltaire Network, who's very good, in an article, Jihadists in Charge of Crowd Control in Kiev Protests, where Voltaire says, quote, there are members of the Azatlik movement, which means freedom, led by young Nail Nabulin and Campaign for Greater Turkey. They are backed by Trotskyist parties such as the Russian Left Front of Sergei Udaltsov, as well as the Turkish government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. They've just come back from Syria, though, through Turkey, where they had gone to practice jihad against the Syrian government. They seem to be behind the provocations that have led to riot police to commit excesses. So that was from Voltaire around the same time. So we can see that Turkey and Ukraine are moving towards greater provocations with Russia. We've got jihadist terrorists inside Russian borders, on Russian borders, Turkey shooting down Russian jets over Syria. You have to wonder how much more of this Russia can take, because they really are poking the bear, and it's not a good idea. Now, remember too, there's an article, we're not going to have time to really go into this, by a friend, Afra Dagher. You've seen her on my on my website, her articles. You've seen her on the videos that we've done together, and she's been a regular guest on this show. There's an article on the website that was written by her, By Way of Deception, How Turkey Considers Its Airspace Violated by Russia. And she was right to point out that this whole situation was entirely a setup. She argues that it was a setup by Turkey to down the Russian jet for these reasons that I've just discussed. And she draws the comparison between the 1967 setup by Israel to bomb the Soviet planes as well that were flying overhead with the Egyptians. So we will perhaps discuss that in the weeks to come. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
Visit pigminenews.com and to subscribe, youtube.com/pigmine7.